I read Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson for the Summer of Cosmere project I'm doing, where I read all of the Cosmere stories in the published order that they came out in. So I've done Elantris, the original Mistborn trilogy, Warbreaker, some of the short stories that came out, including Silence, Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell, The Emperor's Soul, The 11th Metal, The Alloy of Law, and of course, The Way of Kings, the book that happens just before this book, The Words of Radiance. So this is the second book in the Stormlight archive. And we go back to that epic fantasy register that I talked about in The Way of Kings and the kind of classic, what I think of, tritagonist structure of the Cosmere stories. So again, we have Kaladin, Shallan, and Dalinar as our primary antagonists in this story, or protagonists in this story. I think, again, these characters operate with an internal conflict, so they are both the protagonist and the antagonist again. But where The Way of Kings was Kaladin's story, I think that this book is more Shallan's story. And I think I feel that way because this book does her flashbacks and not Kaladin's or Dalinar's flashbacks. So that feels a little bit more like she has a bigger space in the novel. And it feels to me like she evolves a little bit more, although there's a pretty big arc for Kaladin too, and it feels like the end of the book really focuses in on his journey more than Dalinar and Shallan. I think the first time that I read this is when I really connected with Shallan as a character, and she started to become my favorite Stormlight Archive character. But I really love Kaladin's story and how Sanderson allows him to kind of regress a little bit, that it felt like, he ends The Way of Kings on such a high note, and he seems like, such a hero, and he's gone through this terrible journey, and he has reached a new kind of plateau of heroism. But then in this story, it feels like he almost takes a step back and becomes something of the wretch again that he was in the first book, where he's consumed by his bigotry and hatred for the Light Eyes and feelings of insecurity about, being able to hold on to what he's built because he's lost it so many times before. And those things really get in his way of forming healthy relationships with other characters and making wise decisions about what should come next in his life. The first time that I read this, I felt really frustrated with Kaladin. Why are you doing this? Why aren't you telling Dalinar the truth about who you are? Why are you just moping and indulging in self-pity and hatred for the Light Eyes? I get why Kaladin hates the Light Eyes, given everything that's happened to him and the injustice of his society and everything. But like I said, it just feels like a real step back. But the more that I've read this book and reread it, I feel like Sanderson is doing something really great with Kaladin kind of taking a step backwards, if you will, because that is the way that depression actually operates. It's it can be 2 steps forward, 1 step back sometimes. There's kind of a spiraling that happens where you kind of spiral upward out of the depression, and then you spiral back down a little bit. And, as you go through a journey of healing from depression, it's not a straight line. There's not a linear progress to it. There's, as you find new ways to deal with life and to cope, you fall back on these bad habits of the way that you coped with trauma in the past. And it causes you to repeat the mistakes that have been holding you back this whole time. So it's kind of great to see that represented in the story, I think. And I guess I just get into Kaladin's story since I started off with him and just kind of work through what happens with Kaladin in this story. So now Kaladin is the head of Dalinar's like personal guard. He's like a bodyguard, and it's his duty to train the former bridgemen to become other bodyguards and like the head of the armies, basically. He's the highest ranked Dark Eyes in the military. He's a officer, which is something that Dark Eyes never are, I guess. And so Dalinar has given him like all of this privilege and trust, but it has put him in a kind of precarious position where all kinds of people resent him, you know, based on like bigotry and hatred at the same time. And there's no acknowledgement, I think, from Dalinar, at least it feels this way when we're in Kaladin's head, about all the pressure that's on Kaladin. And Dalinar is always asking for more and more and more. He's like, I need these troops trained faster. I need more of them. I need the army to be bigger, because he lost so many of his people in the betrayal that Sadeas dealt him in the previous book. And so he needs to like recruit a whole bunch of people, and he's kind of like putting that on Kaladin in terms of all of the bridgemen that Sadeas lost when Dalinar purchased them with his shard blade. He wants them to be trained to be in the army now because he can trust them to not betray him. But Kaladin's like, he's like 20 or 21 years old. He's a really young guy. And this is like a huge amount of work that Dalinar is putting on his plate. I feel like there's no acknowledgement of that in the story from Dalinar. And Kaladin only looks at this duty as like an obligation. He never thinks of it as like, this isn't fair. This is too much. I can't handle this. He just like takes on those burdens more and more, which I think speaks to that kind of unhealthy savior complex and taking on too much responsibility that I talked about in The Way of Kings. And it's related to the kind of coping mechanisms I think that Kaladin operates under with his trauma, where he has this kind of clinical depression that he's dealt with for his whole life, this part of himself that he contends with and doesn't know what to do, and that he wants somebody to like, subconsciously, he wants somebody to take responsibility for that away from him and kind of like step in and intercede and help with that burden that he feels. And because he has that feeling of wanting someone to help him and kind of catch him when he falls, that's what he tries to do for everyone around him all the time. He's trying to give to other people what no one will give to him. And so when Dalinar asks for more, Kaladin just says yes. He's yes, yes, yes. But the pressure is mounting on him. And I think that contributes to his feelings of being on the outside of the culture. Now, of course, the Dark Eyes are, treated as a subclass of citizen within kind of Vorin society at large. They're just like a step above slaves or serfs. And so Kaladin's feelings in that direction are justified, like societally. But it's not just about that for Kaladin. There's like a larger problem that he's grappling with inside of himself, and that's one piece of the puzzle. This resentment that he feels, I think, is like directly tied to the grief that he's still carrying around the loss of his brother, and then the subsequent loss of his military companions who were killed by Amaram when Kaladin won the Shard Blade, right? It's tied to this sense of betrayal in his own personal belief that the Light Eyes could be honorable people. That belief was crushed in him so utterly that it stole something from him deeper than just the kind of way in which society is constructed unfairly. But I don't think that Kaladin is in a place where he could like articulate all of that fully to himself or anyone else. And instead he just kind of like acts out emotionally and strikes out while he's under all this pressure and his emotions are riding high. It causes him to, on the one hand, he buckles down and takes more responsibility and tries harder, stays up later, pushes himself even more. And then whenever he breaks, all of this passionate hatred pours out. So that's like a really crunchy, complicated, emotional portrayal that Sanderson is delivering to us with Kaladin. And like I said, the first time that I read it, I felt really frustrated by it. It felt like a step backwards. But as I said, the more that I've read this, the more that it feels not only realistic, but like kind of the correct choice emotionally for the character, because he's gotten into this secure place where there are people around him who care about him. There are people who genuinely understand his struggles, and people that he has managed to protect, against all odds when everybody else that he's ever tried to protect has died. Like he's achieved that, all of these things that he's never had before. And I think the progress there is that Kaladin doesn't know how to deal with all of this success. He's only had failure after failure, loss after loss. Now he's in a more secure position and he's kind of freaking out. He doesn't know how to exist in this space where people care about him. He has security and on like that. That's a whole new thing that you have to learn as you like progress out of these bad coping mechanisms and you get into a more secure place. It's like, how do I deal with happiness? And it sounds like that shouldn't be a problem at all. You just feel happy, but it's not that simple emotionally. We are creatures of habit. We have to create new habits. We have to overcome the weaknesses inside of us in order to progress. And I think that's Kaladin's major story in this book. He has to acknowledge the hatred inside of him, but also this desire that he has to protect people with, his martial prowess that he's put so much time and effort into. Is he going to use that, to kill the people that he doesn't like and protect the people that he does like? Or does he have to follow, a different path that has to do with that sense of honor that Syl is bringing into his life for him? So I talked about in Words of Radiance in The Way of Kings, how Syl kind of operates as this supernatural intercessor, right? Like we had the voice of ruin in Vin's head during the Mistborn trilogy, always whispering to her about, how terrible people are and everyone will betray you and you should kill them first and don't trust people. And Syl does the same thing for Kaladin, but in a positive way, where she's telling him, you have Bridge 4 now. They're all safe. You have all of these good things. Maybe you could find someone to fall in love with or to date. And encouraging him to make connections with people and find happiness in his life instead of just taking on more and more responsibility and feeling more and more pressure. So while I think that there's a kind of like natural or like almost biological, biochemical, like in his brain kind of situation with Kaladin where he has clinical depression, maybe like a kind of condition that he was born with or was vulnerable to from his early childhood, that has nothing specific to do necessarily with like trauma from his early life or anything like that. It's just like when trauma comes along, Kaladin's going to feel it more strongly than the average person. And that's just something that's kind of built into him. That trauma, kind of like unlocks something in a way that allows Syl to step into that open space. And it reminds me of what was going on in Mistborn, where they talked about getting their allomantic powers from the snap. And so with like Kelsier being in the pits of Hath-Sin and his wife dying, and that extreme trauma of, being enslaved, being forced to go into these terrible pits and destroy his body bit by bit in order to just like survive another day, and then have the one person in the world that he cared about the most taken away from him. All of that puts such pressure on Kelsier that it breaks his spirit. And that's the moment that his Mistborn powers manifest. And so there's something in the Cosmere about a link between trauma and not just magical abilities, but like in a supernatural intercession, a kind of filling of the gaps in the spirit of the broken person, an opportunity for a spiritual force to move into the places that trauma creates in our spirit. That's the place that Syl steps into for Kaladin and becomes a voice that speaks against his depression. And it feels like it's more than just a kind of like symbolic representation of Kaladin, learning to like new habits and new ways to think about himself and his situation. This isn't Kaladin like healing himself symbolically. It feels like something from the outside holding Kaladin up in a way that mirrors and contrasts, like I keep saying, with Vin of Ruin trying to hold her down. I think this is really closely related also with the slave brand that Kaladin has on his head, and maybe more than the slave brand, the Shash brand. So there's like language that has been branded onto Kaladin's head that tells everyone, who can see it, that he was a slave and who he was sold from and who he belongs to, but also that he is a dangerous person. And all of Bridge 4 kind of goes through this family bonding thing at the beginning of the book, which is really great, where they go to a tattoo place and they all get the same tattoo together. And most of them get it on their forehead where Kaladin has his brand. And this tells people, that if they were a slave, that they no longer are a slave. And also they insist on there being added a picture that represents Bridge 4 as a group. And all of them get that tattoo put on their head. Even Shen, the Parshman, gets it as well. And when they try to put it on Kaladin, his Stormlight abilities don't allow the tattoo to sink into his skin. It kind of treats it the same way that an injury is treated to the body. It's kind of rejected out of his body. But at the same time, the actual scarring of the branding itself remains. So it's not really like healing his body in some kind of sense of like preserving some kind of maximalist version of like physical conditioning that, is the highest potential of Kaladin. Instead, it's preserving, it feels like, some kind of self-image that Kaladin has. It reminds me of Warbreaker, where you had Vasher able to like transform his body, and the other returned gods of Halandren kind of did this unconsciously, right? Where all of the male gods are like these super muscle-built dudes who like, they all look like superheroes, right? Even though they sit around eating candy all day and drinking alcohol. And the women, are all like ridiculously proportioned and whatnot. Vasher looks like a homeless guy or something. He looks like a mountain wanderer with this scraggly beard and this crazy looking hair. And he's not like particularly muscle bound. He's kind of scrawny and scrappy. And then he transforms at the end of the book to look more godlike when he's, in his persona of the peace giver and all of this stuff. When he's kind of like stepping into the role of, his mythic persona. There's something there about in the Cosmere about this connection to investiture and self-image that I think we're seeing happen with Kaladin here. And I don't think that the core element of his identity as it relates to this tattoo situation is the slave. Instead, I think it's the Shash brand. It's the dangerous part. And that's, operates culturally as a warning to his would-be owners that, like, hey, this slave is dangerous. Like, he might kill you, or he might start a rebellion, or blah, 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 all like that. But to Kaladin, he's internalized that dangerous aspect to himself, not in a way of like, I'm a deadly badass warrior, but in a way of everyone that I care about and try to protect dies. I am dangerous to the people that I love. That's how Kaladin sees it. That's the thing that it feels like he's waiting for this whole book, that he's gonna fail Bridge 4 and all of this is gonna fall apart. Dalinar is gonna be killed by his enemies. The king is going to be overwhelmed and Kaladin's not gonna be able to save him. And he's gonna lose this connection that he has with Syl because he always loses everything because he is essentially dangerous. Obviously, this is an unhealthy self-image that Kaladin has, but it is a core truth that he believes, and therefore the Shash brand remains, even though, his other wounds get healed and the tattoo won't take. So there's something about the way that the characters see themselves that has to do with the supernatural healing that's related to things like Miles 100 Lives' ability to get shot in the head with bullets and then instantly come back from it. He's coming back in a way, I think, that he sees himself. And that is also what's going on with Kaladin. And there's an obvious symbolic message that Sanderson is giving us that this is directly related to the way that Kaladin sees himself as a dangerous person. Dalinar eventually kind of promotes Kaladin to be the guard of the king as well. So King Elokar, his nephew, Dalinar's nephew, gets protection from Bridge 4 directly. And so this is more responsibility, but it's also like an acknowledgement of Kaladin's success and the way that he has successfully cultivated Bridge 4 into an effective fighting force. And eventually, Szeth comes back to try to assassinate Dalinar. They all believe that he's coming after Elokar, but of course, at the end of the Way of Kings, he was ordered to hunt down Dalinar and kill him. And we get more insight on that whole situation with Taravangian and how Taravangian is kind of the head of a religious order almost that has its own set of scriptures that come out of a kind of like Nostradamus-esque version of Taravangian, where he kind of like foresaw the future in such a complicated and deep way that nobody really understands the depths of what he was able to kind of calculate, because he's been magically blessed or cursed, however you want to see it, by the Night Watcher. Like, he went in search of the old magic in order to save the world, And what he was given in return for that was this enormous capacity mentally that he paid for with an enormous diminishment in emotional competence whenever he has this high mental competence, and vice versa. So there's other days where he is deeply emotionally competent, like he understands perfectly on an emotional level everything about the world and his place in it, but he is so intellectually deprived that he's basically inarticulate. And then every position in between those two extremes. And that's the reason that Taravangian secured Szeth, because his former brilliant self realized that if they could get a truthless who had one of the honor blades, then they could use it to kind of shake up the entire political situation of the world and secure more and more kingdoms, but also create chaos, which it seems like the end game goal of Taravangian here is to create a situation that the world is so destabilized that it causes another desolation to happen. And this will cause the heralds to return and kind of usher in a new golden age. And so he recruits Szeth into his goals, and he was the one who was behind everything in the first book as far as Szeth going around assassinating various rulers, and now he's after Dalinar. And so Kaladin and Szeth face off for the first time. Szeth has the same abilities that Kaladin has, but he doesn't have a spren like Syl, who is guiding him on a kind of moral journey. Instead, the only thing that he has is this strict personal obedience to defer his own desires to his master's orders. So no matter how Szeth feels about this situation, he doesn't want to assassinate anyone. He feels that murder is deeply wrong and evil, but he still does it at the end of the day. And to him, it's a kind of devotion to his own cultural heritage. This is the right thing to do in Szeth's mind, is to follow the orders no matter how terrible they are, because it demonstrates the way in which he lost faith in his religion. We get little hints and glimpses at what that might mean for Szeth, but it's not totally clear right now in the story. But that's the only thing guiding Szeth morally, is a kind of giving up of his personal responsibility for his actions as an acknowledgement or penance for the way that he has somehow failed his society. And like I said, I think that's related to how Kaladin feels about his own depression and the way that he wants to have someone else kind of take responsibility for that, to kind of step into his life in an unconscious way. I don't think that Kaladin would ever say this, but that's the feeling that I get from Kaladin, that he really wishes he had a master, the way that Szeth does, who could take away the burden of that depression from him, this crushing weight that he feels of being a failure in some way, that he just can't be happy even when things are good. And Kaladin is not able to let go of responsibility. Instead, he just takes more and more responsibility on. So as Szeth takes less and less responsibility for his actions, Kaladin takes more and more, so that they contrast in that way. But anyway, when Szeth shows up to kill Dalinar, it's not a competition of who's the most traumatized and who has the most responsibility and who feels the most depressed. It's cool sword fighting and magic fighting and stuff like that. So we get to see finally this kind of contest between Kaladin, who doesn't really understand his powers yet, and Szeth, who is kind of a master of all of the Windrunner abilities. And this like completely shifts Kaladin's view of what he should be able to do and like sends him in a new direction in terms of like learning more about his powers and investigating this connection that he has with Syl. At the same time, he doubles down on hiding from Dalinar and Adolin and all of the other Light Eyes, his abilities as a Windrunner, because he's still afraid that somehow they're going to take it away from him. And so even though he's the only one who like kind of goes toe to toe with Szeth and survives, he doesn't come out and tell the truth. And there's something there that reminds me of in The Way of Kings, Kaladin really focuses in hard on trying to find a way to get his bridge crew to survive the bridge runs no matter what. And he comes up with this strategy of getting the bridge crew to hold the bridge in a very awkward, weird way, where they use the bridge as a shield as they run at the chasm. And this keeps them safe from the Parshendi attacks as they run up on the chasm, and they're able to get all the way, where they put their bridge in place without a single person dying during the bridge run. And this feels like a success to Kaladin, but then he turns around and he sees what happens with the entire wider army, and then he understands what a significant and like huge systemic failure his crew's survival has caused in the army itself. And so there's this way that like it reveals to him, the truth about what the Bridgemen are in Sadeas's military strategy, that they're just out there for targets. And that's like really depressing and terrible. But there's structurally, like if you step back from it and just look at the construction of it, I think it shows that Kaladin survives this dire encounter. Like he finds a way to survive, and that contributes to the failure of the bigger organization that he is a part of. Like, even though we don't like Sadeas and it's bad, that we don't want success for Sadeas's army, it is still true that doing the bridge run that way is like a bad thing for the army itself. In a similar way, it feels like Kaladin is protecting himself. He's finding a way to survive in this high pressure, completely new situation to him of, finding success, happiness, security, and prosperity. Like he's never had those things before as an adult. And like he doesn't know how to cope with them. And so he's found a survival strategy that is maladaptive, of keeping secrets, of continuing to believe the worst about the Light Eyes, and on like that. And this survival that he has carved out for himself in this situation is contributing to the larger failure of the organization that he is a part of. So Dalinar cannot make strategic choices that would benefit, the security of the king and fighting against Szeth and his supernatural powers, because he doesn't know that Kaladin is a Windrunner. No one can help him or give him the resources to be a better Windrunner in the army because they don't know about it. And so Kaladin is kind of returning to these maladaptive trauma responses that he developed in order to survive, that are holding not only him back, but the organization that he is a part of. And to me, it calls back to the things that I talked about in the Mistborn trilogy, where Vin has all of these maladaptive behaviors that helped her to survive, before she was part of Kelsier's crew. But after she's a part of the crew, she has to unlearn those things. and learn how to accept all the good things in life. Kaladin is on a similar journey. And that's directly related to those ideas of trauma that I talked about as well. And so even though Kaladin survives this encounter with Szeth, there's a feeling of failure through this whole thing. It's a real turning point in Kaladin's story, but it's not the kind of turning point that we might expect in a kind of hero's journey sense, where he's like, oh, I was trying to do this thing and it wasn't working, so I'm going to have to abandon that and move on to the strategy for the rest of the story that will lead to success. Instead, he kind of like doubles down on the failure strategy, because he goes even more to ground. He's like, no, I definitely can't tell Adolin how I survived this fall. I can't tell Dalinar the truth about what I am, because I'll definitely lose it. And so he goes back to the chasms where Sadeas banished him and his bridgemen kind of like to die, and tries to figure out how to become a windrunner. That the windrunners kind of belong in the sky, if you will. Like the skies belong to Kaladin by the end of the story, but the place that he goes to is like kind of the deep underground. So he goes in the exact kind of opposite direction of where he needs to be, where he deserves to be, where he's built to be. And that's because he is making this choice to repeat the same mistakes, because those mistakes are at least familiar to him. And that's the way that trauma and depression works. That's that kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back that I was talking about. That as you experience success, if you've gone, like Kaladin clearly has PTSD. So like you're coming out of PTSD and you're starting to experience success for the first time in your life, you're going to retreat to those strategies that feel familiar to you. And that's going to disrupt that success. But that disruption of success feels more comfortable than the actual success itself. It seems like totally backwards, especially if you're coming at it like having never grappled with deep trauma or PTSD, but it makes total emotional sense if you really like approach it with empathy and think about, what it takes to learn an entirely new way to live your life, to make room for the things that will cause you to flourish. And so he returns to this place of the chasms that, feel comforting to him. They feel like a home, but and he does learn more about his powers there. He's able to share it with Bridge 4, this community that he's been able to develop. And I think this is also like a really important theme in the book. It's expressed with all 3 of the characters, but this idea of like, so Kaladin belongs within Bridge 4. And if we just kind of step back and examine the composition of Bridge 4 in terms of like, not only the Stormlight Archive, but also like Mistborn and the other stories that we've read, Elantris and all of it, all of the Cosmere, we've had all of these divisions between people that happen throughout the books again and again. Like in Warbreaker, we have, the Mountain Kingdom and the Valley Kingdom. We have the gods and the regular people who just have like a normal breath and then the godly breath. We have the Elantrians, and then we have the regular humans. We have the nobles in Mistborn and the Ska, and we have the light eyes, and we have the dark eyes in Roshar, in the Vorin religion, right? So there's like, and then again in the Alloy of Law, right, that I talked about, there's the Roughs people and there's the city people. There's these divisions among people that give them a sense of identity, but that identity is built on exclusion. It's built on difference. Bridge 4 is not constructed that way, because like, who's in Bridge 4? We have, Rock, who is a Horn Eater, and it's not like everyone else is also a Horn Eater. Rock is the only Horn Eater. We have Lopen. There's nobody like Lopen in the entire Cosmere. Like, what a weirdo, right? Like, I love Lopen so much. but there's no one else like him. Scar and Drehy and just on and on. Like every one of the Bridge 4 guys are just like a totally different strata of society. They have, Moash comes from a different kind of family than everyone else. And they're all like these misfits from all over the world who have been brought together and made into a family because of this trauma that they went through. But that shows the way in which, like, their differences are irrelevant because there's all of these commonalities between them. There's a way in which they weren't just forged together by their traumatic experience of going on the bridge runs. That was a part of it. But the real truth, I think that's underneath all of that is that everybody is essentially the same in the Cosmere. There's a way in which everybody is kind of like on the outside. There's this idea of being on the inside or the outside. The light eyes are on the inside, the dark eyes are on the outside. That's when Kaladin talks to Shallan later in the story when they're trapped in the chasms and says to her, like, you did this to me because you benefit from the system of the light eyes that oppresses me. And so when I was put in prison, you participated in that because you aren't fighting for equality. That is a mentality of inside and outside, of essential difference that creates like perpetrators and victims. And that system cannot be overcome. There's no reconciliation there because as soon as you reconcile that system, there is no difference anymore. And so there's no way to construct an identity. The way that the Bridge 4 identity is constructed is that we're all misfits and weirdos, right? I think that's why we love Bridge 4, because we all feel like a part of Bridge 4 when we read the book, right? We feel like I could belong to Bridge 4 too, because I'm a weirdo misfit. Maybe other people don't feel that way. Maybe they feel like they're okay and I'm the weird one, but I suspect that all of us readers love Bridge 4 because we know deep down that nobody really ever actually fits in. I'm not saying that there aren't injustices in society, that there aren't powerful people and powerless people, and that there are imbalances and blah, 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 blah. I'm not saying that. I'm saying when you boil it down on the most essential level, all people are part of a community, and you can't actually step away from that. Like, the differences that people construct are false. They take effort to sustain. The light eyes have to put a lot of effort into their society in order to stay separate from the dark eyes. They have constructed an entire religion to reinforce this difference. They have constructed institutions of slavery to maintain this difference. I mean, you talk about slavery, you have Shen, who's a part of Bridge 4, right? Relaine. You have a person who is automatically a slave in the human system because of his heritage, because he's a parchment. And like we find out later that he's secretly a listener. So there's a way in which like he's both of those kind of things. He's a parchment and a listener, because he was pretending to be one. That's how everybody took him. And so even he is a part of Bridge 4, which means that even the parshmen, even the listeners are co-equal with all of the other people. So these distinctions that we've seen throughout the Cosmere are kind of shown to be false by the way that Bridge 4 is able to be in a community. It's completely inclusive. So it reminds me of like this difference between Wax and Wayne, where in the Alloy of Law, where Wax is trying really, really hard to stop being this Ruff's lawman and trying to be this city high lord. And Wayne just sees all people as like the same thing, right? He's just like, well, you could pretend to be a high society rich guy or a down and dirty beggar, and it's all just the same thing. It's all just accents. It's all just like, where are you from? And you have to look on the inside of people and have empathy, and you're able to kind of talk with anyone because of that. So for Wax, the differences between people are really, really important. And for Wayne, they don't really exist at all. And I think that the story is on the side of Wayne. I think the story is on the side of Bridge 4. And whenever Kaladin invests in this irrational bigotry and hatred against the Light Eyes, the story is against him. Even though I think we as readers can understand that this systemic bigotry in their society is a bad thing, it is unfair, it stands in as a kind of allegorical, symbolic representation of racism in America, kind of segregation and things like that, the treatment of indigenous people across the history and development of American society, for example. Not just here. I mean, you can look at it, through colonialism in Europe and any other culture, honestly, that has struggled with these kind of unfair inside-outside treatments of people. But I think that at large, we as readers understand that it's better to have this community of all instead of this segregated us versus them society. That there's a rejection in the story of the us versus them, and there's an endorsement of the kind of Bridge 4 melting pot, we're all one community, because everybody is broken. And so the success that Kaladin finds in the chasms, I think, is directly due to that community of Bridge 4. It's not about going down into the chasms. It's not about retreating into what is familiar, because all of that is dysfunctional. All of that is maladaptive for Kaladin. It's the one step backwards that I keep talking about. The connecting with Bridge 4 is the good thing. That's the thing that allows him to progress. He connects with Bridge 4, he connects with Syl, and this leads him eventually to fly up out of the chasms and into the sky, where he's shining with light, where he feels free, he feels open, he feels like himself, and he's able to move up and to own the skies. That's how he thinks of it. And so it literally elevates him to an entirely different level. And that starts, I think the root cause of that has to do with this community of Bridge 4. And that, again, is this theme that we've had over and over since Elantris. I keep hitting on it, that Raoden builds the community of the Elantrians. Kelsier builds the community of the thieving crew. And on, that we just have this building of community is the thing that allows the individual to plug into it and to transcend their own weaknesses and failures and to kind of remake themselves, to kind of arc out of their dysfunction and get to a place of prosperity. The Cosmere is not a place where you can get there by yourself. The people who are rugged individuals are very much kind of outsiders and failures. I think you see that in the story with Xyle. Xyle is clearly Vasher from Warbreaker, and he is such a loner. He feels like the Ronin samurai. He feels like the outcast warrior. At the end of Warbreaker, him and Vivenna go off into the sunset to have adventures. And so we don't know where that went, but it seems to have led him to an entirely different world where he's not connected to the community that he's a part of. He's in the Ardentia, he's part of the religion, but he doesn't actually believe in the religion. And it seems like he's hiding from something, from his past or whatever got him to this place. And he doesn't make friends. He doesn't have a community. And so even though Kaladin goes to Xyle over and over for wisdom, the thing that Vasher tells him again and again is, don't be like me. And so that's the only advice that he can offer. And I think it's the right advice for Kaladin, but it points to the way in which Vasher is alone. And so in the Cosmere, again, this is the path to failure is to be alone. You can see that with Szeth's story as well, that more and more he becomes isolated. Again and again, he encounters the truth, like he does in that duel with Kaladin that was such a big turning point for him. He sees that Kaladin is able to use Stormlight in ways that should not be possible unless he's bonded to his friend. And this is very upsetting to him because it has something to do with him being truthless. And it undermines the entire project that he's involved with of deferring his personal responsibility for his actions. And so Szeth just immediately goes into denial. Like, this is not happening. I don't believe it. He goes back to his master and tries to confirm, like, is this thing true? Is this really happening? And, and then his master manages to take away his sense of responsibility again. And he's able to trick himself into believing a thing that deep down he knows is not true. And this further isolates him. He no longer believes his master. He doesn't believe that he is actually truthless. He doesn't have a community that he can rely upon. A Taravangian doesn't have Szeth's best interests at heart. He uses Szeth as an object. He's not treating him as a person. And so Szeth is completely alone. And then what happens to Szeth? He fails. He's killed. And so that is the story, kind of illustrating to us what the origin of failure for Szeth is, the way in which he is not connected to community. And the success of Kaladin is directly associated with his connection to Bridge 4 and his community. It's only after Kaladin tells Dalinar the truth that he's able to defeat Szeth. Bringing himself fully into the community and trusting Dalinar, to include Dalinar in his circle of trust, is to expand the community that he relies on. That is when he is able to access all of his powers and fully enter into success in the story. The other big thing that's happening here, of course, for Kaladin, though, is this question of for the greater good, this kind of trolley problem thinking that we've had ever since Elantris, where Rathan had these thoughts that it's better for him to feel like a hypocrite and to kind of suffer and be on the outs of his religion than it is for entire nations to be rolled over by Wyrn when they don't convert to his religion successfully. And so sacrificing one person or doing some dirty deeds or behaving in a hypocritical way is better than large-scale failure. This is the problem that's posed by the trolley problem, right? Where you have an outer control train and it's barreling down and it's going to hit a crowd of people, or you can throw a switch and divert it and one person will be run over instead. Even if that one person is you, the trolley problem kind of introduces a mathematical way of thinking about human life that equalizes all life. And so every individual is kind of worth one human life, and therefore many human lives are more valuable than one human life. And we can make these kind of calculated trades in a way that is moral, because there's a kind of mathematics to the morality now, right? And that kind of thinking enters into a calculus that Kaladin has about Elhokar, the king, where he already has this hatred and bigotry towards the Light Eyes because of all the trauma in his life, but also the injustice that systemically exists in the society. And Moash stokes that by telling about his own personal history and the way that Moash, or his grandparents, were killed by Elhokar's choices, and that was also related to Rishon being put into Kaladin's community as a child and leading directly to the death of his brother and all of the suffering of Kaladin's family. All of that is traced back to Elhokar. So the problem here is like personal, but we also see it like on a larger scale that Elhokar is like really messing up the entire war against the Parshendi. He's messing up Alethi society. He's not a good king. He's a poor leader. He's fractured his kingdom through mismanagement. And there's many ways in which it feels like Elhokar is not a good king, and Dalinar would be a better ruler. And in many ways, he already operates as a king throughout the book. He overrides Elhokar constantly. And so in Kaladin's mind, he kind of like justifies this plot against Elhokar to assassinate him and install Dalinar in his place because it would, quote unquote, be good for the kingdom, right? That would make the best thing for everyone. It would accomplish a kind of personal, emotional satisfaction of getting rid of the person who caused so much suffering in his own life and in his friend's life, Moash's life, but also it would like benefit the kingdom if you're looking at it in this kind of mathematical calculus. This whole calculated way of thinking is 100% the way that Taravangian is approaching things as well. And I think that's the big clue in the Stormlight Archive. Like if you don't read the rest of the Cosmere, you could just see it here in the Stormlight Archive, that this way of thinking, according to the story, is villainous. It's evil. Because he's willing to like take all of these sick people or people who are marginal in societies, like the homeless and people who he says won't be missed, quote unquote, and bleed them out in order to get these kind of supernatural death rattles that give them glimpses of the future and allow them to kind of like reinterpret this Nostradamus style scripture that they're operating from. The idea being that there's some kind of catastrophe on the way, that like Taravangian is participating in this catastrophe. He wants it to happen because it's going to cause the heralds to come back and in his mind maybe usher in a golden age. But at the same time, he believes that it's inevitable that these evil supernatural forces of Odium and the Voidbringers are going to return. The desolation will definitely happen. And so all of this horror that he is inflicting on the world is to mitigate to whatever level he can the inevitable losses. In other words, there's no way to actually solve this problem in Taravangian's mind. And so he has to kill the least people possible in the trolley problem. And I think that's what Sanderson is kind of getting at allegorically, symbolically, with the rejection of this kind of thinking in the Cosmere. It's characterized as a failure, as the root of evil for the characters. Because the bedrock premise of this style of thinking is that there's no way out. There's no solution to the problem. And we talked about this before in the Mistborn trilogy, that, and Elantris even, that Raoden doesn't see being stuck in Elantris as a curse. He sees it as a blessing. Kelsier doesn't see the failures that they experience as they fight the Lord Ruler as setbacks, but as new opportunities to evolve the heist plan to displace the Lord Ruler, right? That there's always a solution. There's always another mystery to solve. That thinking that there is always a solution, that faith and hope, that is the side of good in the Cosmere. And the reason that this trolley problem thinking is bad is because it assumes from the outset that there is no solution. So Taravangian has already accepted failure, and he's just trying to aim for the least failure possible. And the same thing is true with Kaladin and his relationship to the king in the book. That Elhokar cannot be reformed. That, he believes that he, as a person, and maybe he doesn't believe this, and maybe that is part of the problem, but, the wretch brought him to the honor chasm in the Way of Kings, and he was going to jump in and commit suicide. And then he kind of symbolically believes that the wretch went down in that chasm and he's dead. And now this second chance Kaladin exists. So he kind of remade himself. And he's not giving Elhokar the benefit of that doubt. He doesn't think that Elhokar is capable of that. Maybe he doesn't believe that he himself is actually capable of it, that he will never get over the wretch. Maybe he does believe that at this point, and so he can't believe in that for other people. But the point being that Kaladin has already, his bedrock premise of the way that he's approaching this problem of Elhokar is to believe that it is a situation that exists in a state of failure. There is no way to shift things out of failure. And therefore, you got to do the best with the resources you have, right? This gets back to the way that Tien died, where the soldier tells him, you got to make the best of a bad situation. And he sacrifices the quote unquote worthless, untrained soldiers so that the good soldiers survive. That's the same thing that Amaram tells him when it comes to the shard blade. He awards it to Kaladin, who refuses it. And then by refusing it, Amaram says, well, I am trained in how to use shard blade and shard plate. Therefore, it's the best thing for society that I use it, and therefore I have to kill all of you to cover it up. Kaladin has moved into that same way of thinking, and that is the failure of, his character spiritually in the book. And when he realizes that he's done that, that's when he's able to kind of snap out of it and take those 2 steps forward. That when he's on the same side as Amaram, when he's on the same side as the soldier who killed Tien, that he's on the wrong side of the tracks here. There's a refusal of the entire premise of the trolley problem here that, well, we either have to kill a small amount of people or a large amount of people. And what the Cosmere is saying, what Sanderson is saying is how about we come up with a solution where no one dies? How about we, blow the train up or something, or we pull everyone off the track? Whatever that solution might be, it's possible that there is a solution where no one dies. And we have to believe that, and we have to find that. That is where goodness lies in this story. And so once Kaladin realizes that he has made the wrong choice, even though in the calculus of things, it feels like, yeah, we can understand, we agree that Elhokar is not a good king. We understand all of the reasons that he made these choices. It seems justified, but there's that feeling that he has deep down that is leading him to, see that this is not the right choice, that there's something wrong there. And, symbolically, it also is related to his bond with Syl being broken, where Syl stands in that spot of being the supernatural voice of goodness that is bolstering Kaladin and allowing him to change in this positive way. Well, he's making this choice that he's going to kill the king, and that supernatural voice abandons him. So that's a huge signal that he's making the wrong choice, right? And he blames that on a simplistic view of right and wrong and good and honor and on like that. But what it really comes down to is this feeling that Kaladin himself has deep down. He knows that this choice is wrong on some level, even if he can't articulate why. And when he's fully able to see himself as the Amaram in the situation, then he realizes, oh, this is why I had this bad feeling all along. That bad feeling, to me, goes back to those internal feelings that I talked about with Ellen Venture, where he allows his internal moral compass, his conscience, to be his guide, and not the mores of his society, the kind of, noble blood are not supposed to mingle with the ska, and you're not supposed to see them as people. And before he ever enters into the story, he had already rejected all of those things. He had rejected his father's way of life based on the feelings that he had inside about the whole thing. And so it's the same thing with Kaladin. The Cosmere is showing us that, you need to trust in your internal conscience in order to align yourself with goodness. And I think that comes back to the thing that I also keep harping on, that the Cosmere intrinsically believes that people at the end of the day are good, that there is a goodness in all people, and that we can tap into that goodness to discover the truth and to find the right way to treat each other and behave. And so at the end of the story, we get this awesome moment of Kaladin progressing spiritually, where he reconnects with Syl, and he says the next part of his creed and gains more power. And there's also something there, just to talk about the kind of connections between elements of the Cosmere that we've seen that are like these formal elements, that when he takes that oath, literal glyph appears on the ground, that it just reminds me of Elantris, right? Where there's so important to that magical moment, the catharsis moment, where Raoden realizes that the entire city itself is constructed in the shape of the word spirit. And then he has to add that last element to the ideogram to restore it to the way that it's supposed to be. That when Kaladin realigns himself spiritually with the path that he's supposed to be on, it's kind of ratified in the story with a symbol that appears behind him. I mean, it's a super cool visual. And I think that's the major part of the reason why it's there, because it's just cool. But it's just also a subtle connection to me between this spiritual path and language, and the significance of language in the Cosmere. And I'll talk more about that when we get to Shallan. But yeah, I think Kaladin's story overall has to do with that success of stepping out of that cycle of depression, being linked to his expanding the community of people beyond the Bridge 4 melting pot that is only consisting of dark-eyed people and enslaved people. He extends that first to Renarin, who, is a light-eyed person. He makes friends with Adolin. He makes friends with Shallan. And so he starts to let these people in who are light-eyed. That really disrupts his ability to carry this bigotry forward towards the light-eyed society. And then finally, he includes Dalinar in the circle of people that know his secret of being a Windrunner. And then finally, everyone in the society knows that he is a Windrunner, and he achieves full success. He wins, if you will, at the end of the book, because he has expanded that circle of inclusion to everyone. There is no more inside and outside, us versus them, perpetrator and victim duality. Instead, the entire community is included. And he goes on to trouble the inside-outside dichotomy even more with Syl from time to time, right? If you think about it, where he talks about, well, what about who I am in the perspective of the Parshendi that I killed? Like, I was defending my people, but what about if I was a Parshendi and I was trying to defend my people there? How am I right to fight them just because they're different than me? How is that any different from how the light eyes treat the dark eyes? And so he's already started to break down that dichotomy as well, and have a wider circle of inclusion of community for the people in the Cosmere. So I talked for all of this time about Kaladin when I was like, it's not really Kaladin's story, it's Shallan's story. So like, I guess I have to move on to Shallan, who in The Way of Kings, I talked about how I think that Shallan and Kaladin feel like two sides of the same coin to me. They feel like the yin yang, the kind of different energies that contrast with each other and give us a fuller kind of picture of spiritual progression and heroism in the Cosmere, because I think it would be really easy to create a story where, and it's a classic story, right, of the hero's journey, where you take the peasant, you take the slave, and you eventually elevate them to the pinnacle of society. So like, you know, Spartacus, or, you know, a lowly hobbit who lives in a hole saving the entire world in Lord of the Rings, and on like that, you know, David in the Bible and whatever. Kaladin's story is connected to a classic, you know, storytelling mode where you go from humble origins to the heights of society and success, and that's a tried and true formula. Shallan's story really contrasts with that and gives us a fuller picture, I think, that contributes to the inclusion of everyone, because she is the opposite of Kaladin. She's privileged, she's part of the light-eyed society, she doesn't have to contend with these forces of bigotry that systemically hold her down. Instead, she has the systemic benefits of slavery and of the oppression of the dark eyes. That is where a lot of her success in life, quote unquote, comes from. You know, like her wealth and her family holdings are directly derived from the systems of slavery and dark-eyed oppression. And furthermore, she's a part of this, you know, elite group of academics and on like that. And so her story comes from a completely different direction societally than Kaladin's does. And I think that works not only to contrast one with the other, which is, you know, helps with the storytelling, and we're not just hearing the same kind of story again and again, but like I said, also shows the way in which everybody is included in the kind of circle of personhood, if you will, that this is not a story that breaks down cleanly into perpetrators and victims, that it's about being a person and the struggle that we all have with our personal traumas and weaknesses, and the necessity of finding a community to not only transcend, but to lift each other up and build something that helps us all on this journey of life that we're on. And so there's a paradox there that I think makes a lot of people in this book uncomfortable. There's a lot of people I see online who come out against Shallan, that she is a bad person because she takes Kaladin's boots, and we should never, you know, trust her again after that. That moment is not funny, that moment is like traumatic and points to the way in which Shallan is essentially a bad person. Oh, and also don't forget about all the, you know, terrible things that Shallan does and how she murdered her father which we see up close and brutally at the end of the story, and on like that. The contrast between Shallan and Kaladin is a contrast about a good person in Kaladin and a bad person in Shallan, and that the story is somehow misunderstanding that she's a bad person and presenting her to us as if she is a hero. And I think what the story is actually doing is presenting us intentionally with a paradox. And a paradox is, like, I talked about this in Mistborn and the importance of the notion of paradox and how it helps us to not be boxed in as people. And this also, like, played into Warbreaker and the difference between a character like Nightblood and a character like Vivenna, right? Where Nightblood is constructed according to this kind of order that he has to destroy evil. That is the core principle of his entire selfhood. He has a command to do a thing, and he's never going to be able to transcend or supersede that command. In some way, that command will always be at the core of what he is. But Vivenna had a purpose in Warbreaker at the beginning of the story and a totally different purpose at the end. And that's not because she was some kind of hypocrite. It's because as a person, she exists as a paradox who can evolve and transcend her purpose in life and find an entirely new purpose. And so I think what we're being presented here with is this picture of paradox about heroism in the story. On the one hand, we have Kaladin, who is wrestling with a very kind of materialist moral realism, where when he makes choices that he genuinely kind of thinks make moral sense to him, like a logical moral sense, that he needs to stand against Elhokar, he needs to contribute to him being assassinated for the good of the kingdom, that makes sense to him in a like morally calculated way. And the response to that on a spiritual level is that Syl abandons him. So again, we're coming up against these hard walls in the Cosmere of good and evil, that Kaladin has sincerely thought about what is good and bad in this situation and has come to a rational, mindful decision that he honestly thought deeply about and took his time with. And there was a way in which there's a kind of materialist response to that from the universe is a rejection of that moral choice. That it says to him, Syl says, you are a bad person if you do this and believe this. There is no way to be a good person and do this at the same time. And so he's grappling with a sense of sincerity, with a sense of integrity. He has to both embody the actions and intentions that his intentions and actions need to be aligned and fully embodied in his behavior. And that is the soul of heroism in Kaladin's story. But when we look at Shallan's story, she is constantly a liar. She is misrepresenting herself all the time. She literally changes what she looks like and appears to be someone she is not. And all of that is ratified to be heroic by her supernatural creature pattern. And so that would seem to be a contradiction in, the way that if we're talking about good and evil in the universe, like it seems like there should be a pattern of behavior that is consistent and applies to all people equally all the time. And that it, by going according to the way that Kaladin lives his life, you would be a good person in the Cosmere. And yet Shallan is doing the exact opposite. She is not reconciling her past behavior to her current choices. She is misrepresenting herself and lying to people and stealing from people. And all of that is treated as like clever and good and moral in the story. The way that those two styles of heroism directly contrast and clash and are in fact like incompatible presents us with a paradox. And this goes right back to what I talked about paradox in the Mistborn trilogy. At the end of it, you have Sazed taking on the powers of preservation and the powers of ruin at the same time. And that is the kind of like triumph of that story, is to take these two incompatible elements and bring them together into one person, because all of us are contradictions. That is what it means to be a person, because that being a paradox is what allows you to change when you make poor choices and hurt people into being a better person. There's no chance that you could ever be a bad person and then become a good person if we weren't a paradox. And I think that's what some readers actually want when they talk about Shallan being a bad person. They want a world in which there's a kind of simple moral dualism where you are kind of showing your true colors to the world by behaving in an evil way. And that once you have kind of done these bad things, then it marks you out as forever being bad. There's no coming back from it. I think there are all kinds of reasons that people believe this kind of thing, but just within the context of the story, I think what the story is trying to communicate to us is that it's always possible for people to change, that there is room for moral improvement in people at any given time. And it's not the case that morality and goodness are this simple one way to live a life kind of situation. Instead, Sanderson is kind of troubling what heroism and goodness are by focusing in on Shallan's story in this book and by giving her a kind of co-equal status with Kaladin from the previous book. So by having her backstory in the flashbacks, she steps into the position structurally that Kaladin occupied in the first book. And she even does this like in a more formal way in the book by literally, like at the beginning of the book, she's on a ship and she gets shipwrecked, and then she encounters Tavlakov, the same slave trader who Kaladin was with at the beginning of The Way of Kings. And she gets into the same slave cage that Kaladin was trapped in at the beginning of The Way of Kings. And she rides all the way to the war camp in the same cage. She has Gaz there with her, who is the companion to Kaladin. And so her story structurally is intentionally meant to mirror Kaladin's story of coming to the war camp. It's with the exact same people. There's direct connections being formed by Sanderson between these two characters, and not to merely contrast, the ways in which it's totally opposite, right? That Shallan doesn't view the slave cage as a form of imprisonment, but as her vehicle that is owed to her as the leader of the party. And if you think back to The Way of Kings, Tavlakov even offers to Kaladin, like, how about you lead the group since, you tore up my map? That must mean that you know the way to get to our destination. And so you go ahead and be the leader. And Kaladin refuses to do it. Shallan does step into that position. She puts herself in the position of being the leader and telling Tavlakov what to do. And she does it from the slave cage. The whole time that Shallan is doing this, though, the way that she is dealing with herself is a kind of double think, where she is imagining what it would be like for her to be a different person, to be more like Yasna, and to command the kind of authority and respect that Yasna seems to automatically get. Shallan starts to understand that Yasna, the way that Yasna has a royal bearing, causes people to respond to her in a particular way, and that they don't just listen to her, automatically. They listen to her because the way she treats herself and the way she treats everyone around her. And so even though Shallan doesn't believe that she deserves to be treated as a leader, or that she has, the qualities of a leader, she behaves as if she does have those qualities. And then she is responded to as if she has earned them. And that there's something there about that, like, that's the way in which we perceive each other as people, right? That people respond to each other in terms of how they expect to be treated, whether they have earned that position or not. And I think because we have that special insight into Shallan's behavior, it seems, like that she is a poser. She literally is posing as if she has authority that she hasn't earned. And so that makes us feel as readers that like she's being deceptive and that this must be bad because lying to people is a bad thing. But I think it's just showing the way in which this is another avenue to progression. Kaladin has earned his progression every step of the way. He has put in the time and trained. When he goes down into the chasms to learn more about his powers, he puts hours and hours into practicing sticking things to the wall and, changing the orientation of gravity for himself personally. Whereas Shallan just kind of feels it out internally and then fakes her way through every situation. I don't think that the story shows what Shallan is doing as being a failure or a bad thing. Instead, it's just another avenue to the same destination. Like, we talk about the theme in the Stormlight Archive of journey before destination. It's not the same journey for all these characters, even if it is the same destination at the end of the day. The journey is what is more significant than the destination. That's what that creed means. And that journey is essentially different and highly individual for each and every person. And I think that's the point of this paradox of heroism that we're being presented with here. And Shallan leverages that kind of paradox, that energy in the story, where in The Way of Kings, we saw that she has this kind of supernatural ability to have a photographic memory. She literally blinks her eyes and it's like the aperture of a camera closing and impressing that image on the film, right? That is happening on her mind. And then she is able to do a kind of photographically realistic sketch of whatever it is that she just saw. In Words of Radiance, she doesn't just reproduce the things that she sees. Instead, she starts to innovate and iterate on it in an imaginative way. So she starts to include variations on what she saw. She does these sketches for the slave traders and then eventually for the deserters who she picks up like Gaz, where she presents them in a different light than the way that they are holding themselves. So they're like slouched over, they're unshaven, they're unkempt, their uniforms are ragged. And then in the drawing, she gives them a different bearing. She cleans up their uniform. She, gives them a nice haircut in the drawing. And then that representation of art reveals to them a different version of themselves that they could then see themselves as that more heroic version and aspire to be that. This reminds me of the Emperor's Soul, right? And in that story, we get these variations of who the Emperor could be. and the constraints that exist around art in the Cosmere, that there's limitations to how much Shai in the Emperor's soul could vary from the Emperor's behavior. She couldn't turn him into a completely different kind of guy and have that magically ratified by the Cosmere. It would be rejected. It wouldn't work. And so these changes that Shallan is making are subtle and small, but they are also profound in the same way that Shai made these changes in the Emperor that got him out of this cycle of relying on his advisors too much and deviating from his personal conscience to moving back to a place where he can improve life for everybody in the kingdom, because she constructed a slightly different history, a slightly different way of thinking that wasn't outside of the realm of possibility for the Emperor. So Shallan makes a portrait of Gaz where it's slightly different and he cares more about his appearance. He has more self-confidence, and the moral failures of cowardice and gambling and indifference are minimized in the picture, and the ways in which that he is brave and a survivor are emphasized instead. And this allows Gaz to reconfigure the way that he sees himself and kind of transcend these weaknesses in his character and see himself more the way that he believes Shallan sees him. It gives him hope and faith that he is not a finished and ruined person. This gets back to the thinking of Taravangian, right? That there's an unsolvable problem about the way that Gaz is. Gaz is a bad person. And this is what I'm talking about when people judge Shallan in the story as being a bad person, and you can see it in this scene and that scene, and there's just, no way out of it. That is a way of thinking that in the story is being rejected, that there is no way out, that there is a hopelessness to that kind of thinking, where Shallan is presenting possibilities to people, and she's doing it through art. And her entire arc has to do with those variations in a person that art can reveal to us. And so by looking at all of the different variations, we actually kind of sift through the murkiness of uncertainty and kind of find the truth that is hidden under all of that. I think that by constructing the persona of Vale, we see that there are actions that Shallan takes, no matter whether she is Shallan or Vale or whoever she's pretending to be, that are consistent, and that those are the real deep qualities of Shallan that are being cultivated by pattern to make her into the radiant knight who she will, become in the fullness of the story. So, for example, Vale agrees to work with the Ghostbloods, but does so in order to kind of infiltrate their organization and find out why they assassinated Yasna and were trying to kill her. But also they're associated with her father and his death and, their entire family situation with the Soulcaster. And so she wants to solve the mystery of what this organization is, and she pretends to be someone else in order to get that information. And she goes out on retrieval missions to infiltrate Amaram's camp and to go and find out about the Herald who showed up at the end of the Way of Kings. And while she does recover information and give it over to them, she doesn't give them all the information, right? She doesn't betray some core element of who Shallan and Vale both are. She merely kind of manipulates elements of herself in order to find out the information that she is looking for, and then hand over other information that is less sensitive and will not help to advance the goals of the Ghost Bloods, who she doesn't trust, obviously, because they killed so many people that she cares about. So I guess what I'm saying is you could imagine a version of things where Shallan creates this persona of Vale, and then just like Szeth kind of forgoes any sense of personal responsibility and says, well, Vale would give them all of the information. They are asking for this. It has nothing to do with what I want. I have to play the part perfectly. I have to fully embody this character in order to, have integrity in my art and fully express the, persona that I have created in Vale. She's not doing that. Like, the persona of Vale is a tool that she is using to retrieve information for her own ends, and then she is manipulating the Ghost Bloods to hold them at arm's length because she doesn't trust them. I think it's also interesting that she is accepted into the Ghost Bloods, which contrasts directly with Bridge 4, right? But in interesting ways, because like in their acceptance, they're like, hey, you've got to get a tattoo of this symbol somewhere on your body, in the same way that Bridge 4 gets a tattoo that has to do with their organization blatantly on their forehead. They're like, it's okay if you put it in an inconspicuous and hidden place, but it has to be somewhere on your body. And then when you look at who is included in this group of the Ghost Bloods, it's an incredibly eclectic and weird group of people. Just like in Bridge 4, right? It's not like a vertically aligned kind of stratum or something of society. I guess a stratum is horizontally aligned. What am I saying? But you get what I mean, where it's like all light-eyed people who, the kind of society that you see with Taravangian's followers, where they're all kind of Amaram and the other guy who works with Moash, I can't think of his name. And they're all like shard bearers, and they're all light-eyed people. And they seem to all be men also. I guess there are women as well. But you get what I'm saying. They're all like a certain stratum of society. They're kind of a monoculture, if you will. Whereas the Ghost Bloods are like, they feel like they're from all over the place. They're all very different from each other. And they're willing to take in Vale, who is different than all of them. And in fact, that's why they value her, because she's so exceptional and weird and different. And so they have a real valuing of the individual in the same way that Bridge 4 does. And they also have that tattoo thing. So, but it feels as if the Ghost Bloods are evil, where the Bridge 4 is good. So that's why I always feel like I said, that Shallan and Kaladin's story directly contrast with each other. They feel upside down from each other. Kaladin gets so much back from Bridge 4. They support him so much. They help him to progress and grow. And the Ghost Bloods kind of do that for Shallan, but there's a very antagonistic relationship between her and the Ghost Bloods. There's a very misrepresenting herself kind of element to the Ghost Bloods, where she's not telling them the truth. She's holding them at arm's length, and she doesn't think of herself as being part of them, even if they think of her as being an ally of theirs. Instead, Shallan's community kind of comes from when she meets Adolin and starts to build a genuine relationship with him. And the way that she does that is not by presenting this false face that she does to everyone else. At first on their date, she tries to pretend to be the kind of proper light-eyed lady, asking all the right questions of him. And then things take a turn when she asks about poop and what you do in your shard plate when you have to go to the bathroom, right? And that whole thing cracks open a vulnerability in Adolin that Shallan immediately accepts, that he's not presenting himself as the great hero who, leaps chasms and slays his foes. Instead, he's a guy who sometimes has to poop. And what do you do when that happens? And you can't wipe yourself when you're in shard plate. And all of these, literally messy details reveal a true person in Adolin's kind of heroic, cool boy persona. And Shallan is also revealing herself as the woman who is led by her curiosity in trying to find out the secrets of everything around her. These are the primary heroic virtues of her as a character, I think. And when she shows that side of herself to Adolin, Adolin accepts her. He wants to be with her. He grows this romantic interest, and this kind of legal situation that exists between them around the betrothal becomes something more emotionally real for both of them. But even though I say that she's not deceiving Adolin, that she's kind of like showing the real side of herself, she's not totally open with Adolin, right? She doesn't reveal that she has these special powers. She doesn't reveal the way in which she's mixed up with the Ghost Bloods, and that she has secondary agenda to her entire presence on the plains. She includes him first before anybody else in the truth that, Jasnah has kind of discovered that the Voidbringers and the Parshmen are the same thing. But she doesn't tell him, about her tragic past with her parents, the dire situation of her family, the way in which her family is like really broken. Because in the flashbacks that we get, we see how each one of her brothers has coped with this terrible situation of the broken family in their own dysfunctional way. And so you have, one of the brothers tortures animals. Another one goes off and kind of like finds another father figure in the Ghost Bloods and devotes himself to that, and it ends up destroying him. And you have another brother who falls into gambling and, drinking. And so there's just all this dysfunction in the family. Everybody's coping with the father's abuse and the belief that their father is a murderer who doesn't have the integrity to turn himself in various ways. And the father, Shallan's father is himself a kind of persona who is misrepresenting himself to the family and the world at large in order to create the stability for the family to persist. And so what I mean by that, but by the end of the story, we find out that Shallan actually murdered her mother somehow, that she had a shard blade when she was a very young girl in the form of Pattern, it seems like, and she killed her mother with it. And then her father covered the whole thing up to protect her. And within the family, let people believe that he killed his own wife out of jealousy because it seemed like she was with some other man who was her lover. But it seems like the entire situation was totally different and had to do with Shallan's radiant abilities, and that she was going to be killed for that, because we see various Radiants throughout the story being hunted down in an effort to stop the desolations from returning, the calculus being the kind of opposite of what Taravangian's involved in, right? Where they're trying to make the world more and more chaotic for the Heralds to return and usher in a new golden age. There's a whole group of people who are trying to do the opposite and stop the Heralds from returning in order to maintain the status quo and keeping the Voidbringers forever at arm's length. And so Shallan, being one of these emerging Radiants, would need to be sacrificed in order to maintain the peace that has existed for the last 3,000 years. And instead, Shallan, tragically kills her mother in a kind of self-defense, it feels like. And then, further on in her memory, we see the moment where she kills her father ultimately. But the point being that her father takes on this false face to the family, and the brothers all believe that he killed their mother, but in fact, it was their sister. And you feel like if they knew the truth about Shallan, that they would hate her as much as they hate their father. And the burden of him protecting his daughter in this way and dealing with the grief of the loss of his wife, while also having to deal with the feelings of the murderer was this person who he loves so much in his daughter, but can't find any justice. That deception and living in that kind of persona breaks him down to the point where he becomes an abusive and dysfunctional person eventually. And Shallan puts an end to that when she kills him. So she kills both of her parents. And I talked about how Kaladin sees himself as dangerous, as this is like an essential core element of who he is, because he is always trying to save people, but instead they end up being destroyed. There's a way in which Shallan is actually that thing, that she is dangerous to the people around her in a more literal way, where she has killed both of the people, who were closest to her, that made her literally who she is. And that, you're supposed to take care of your family, and instead she kills them instead, so there is a way that Shallan is the thing that Kaladin believes himself to be, but is not. That to me, it like closely connects those characters, that she has to hold herself at a remove and not acknowledge, what happened in her past, because then she will see herself the way that Kaladin does, and she will never be able to find happiness or live her life. And so she wants to construct lies around everything as a way to protect herself, as a way to survive. And that has worked for her up to this point. But you can see in the father, I think, the way that over the long term, that will end up destroying you. This trying to put this energy in these two opposite directions of like, here is who you really are, and then here is how you need to pretend to be in order to survive and exist. Those things eventually pulled her father apart and turned him from a happy man who was never violent into a cruel person that eventually, killed his servants and his wife and crippled his son and on and had to be stopped. And it feels like there's a connection there too between, Elhokar, if you look at him as kind of the father of his land in terms of like how kingship operates in a kind of Confucian sense, and the way that Elhokar is dysfunctional as a leader, and the way that Kaladin sees his place as like, I'm going to remove this dysfunctional leader for the good of all people, and maybe even for the good of Elhokar himself. This would be what was best for him. Shallan has made this choice to remove her father from the family by killing him, because he can't control himself anymore, and he's going to destroy the entire family. I think that decision to do that on Shallan's part is born out of a sense of hopelessness, and that same kind of thinking that had to do, with Taravangian, with the way that Elhokar was being treated, that there is no solution to this family, that the burden of the secret of what really happened and Shallan's guilt was too much for the father to bear, and that there was no reconciliation possible with the rest of the family. And Shallan believes all that, and so murder is like the only solution to the situation. I think she believes all that because she, at her core, believes the same thing that Kaladin does, that she is irredeemably bad. That there is something about her that is dangerous and bad, essentially. And because she believes that, she has to construct these lies around who she is as a person and kind of enclose that true self completely in deception and then deny that it's there at all and reconstruct a totally new persona and live in that persona. That whole situation of, constructing a new person is what attracts Pattern in the first place. He calls it a powerful lie. And if think again back to the Emperor's Soul and the way that Shai could construct different versions of herself that have a slightly different history and allow her to have these different capabilities. There's something similar about that with Shallan's artistry, that she's constructing this persona of a light-eyed researcher and academic who can laugh and be bubbly and be witty and have wordplay and fall in love with, the most eligible bachelor in the world and never have to come in contact with this more essential self. That's the dysfunctional response to her trauma that she is working her way through in her story. And Pattern forces her again and again to come back into contact with that core self that she is in denial about and strip away the lies that are wrapped around her past. So in the first book, he forces her to come to a place where she admits that the reason her father is dead is because of her. And we see that event up close and personal when she uses the gift that he gave her in the necklace to strangle him to death after poisoning him. But additionally, we find out that the reason for his dysfunction had to do with the fact that she murdered her own mother. And so she killed both of her parents. And this is a truth that she's hidden from herself, but is also a revelation to us as the reader. So when we go through Shallan's story, I said this in The Way of Kings as well, we experience Shallan in the same way that she experiences herself, because Sanderson has formally constructed within the story a way in which Shallan doesn't understand the truth about herself. She's hidden it from herself. And when she encounters it, we encounter it at the same time. And after these truths are admitted by her to Pattern, that connection cannot be hidden from her. Again, she can't admit this about herself and then just go back to pretending like it never happened. There's a supernatural element that is interceding once again in the trauma of her experience and forcing her to align more closely internally with who she is. And I think that's the core element of goodness that actually connects Shallan and Kaladin. It's not about specific behavior. It's not about, integrity and telling the truth. It's actually a virtue of Shallan's that she lies to people. When she lies to Gaz about how she perceives him, it helps Gaz to transform into a better version of himself. When she lies to herself about her past and who she is, it allows her to transcend her pain and the terrible things that she's done and do new things which are good. It's not the lying and the deception that's the actual problem. That is not where badness lies in the Cosmere, in other words. Instead, it's this kind of integrity that has to do with goodness in the Cosmere. I talked about Ellen Venture and his connection to his conscience. Raoden and his connection to hope, to reframing things. That reframing, I think, is directly related to what Shallan does. She reframes the people around her and expresses that in her art and gives it to them. And that allows them to reframe themselves. That's not exactly a lie. Instead, it reveals a deeper truth that allows them to change their behavior without misaligning their sense of themselves. This gets back to the thing that I was talking about kind of mechanically within the magic system that has to do with Miles' 100 lives, the way that Kaladin is not able to heal the Shash brand, the way that you see yourself in the Cosmere, not just like physically, but like I said with Kaladin, the way that he kind of spiritually sees himself as a dangerous person fundamentally controls something about your sense of integrity. And so I think Gaz sees himself as a deserter loser who is a coward, who doesn't pay back his debts and is unreliable. And then Shallan gives him this opportunity to believe something different about himself. And he is able to realign the way that he sees himself and then change his behavior in a way that doesn't feel inauthentic. That is the path to goodness. When Raoden reframes what Elantris is for the rest of the people trapped in that cursed city, that is when they start to build a functional community that nurtures the qualities about the individuals that make them worthwhile members of the community. The thing that Pattern is doing for Shallan is not ratifying her lies and giving her the power to tell more powerful mistruths. He is more deeply aligning Shallan with the truth about herself in a way that gives her access to integrity, which she would never have without him. She would never have the strength to pierce those lies that are giving her the strength to carry on from this tremendous trauma of losing her family. So the thing that is making Shallan good and turn into a Knight Radiant to becoming more and more of a hero in the story is aligning herself with herself. It's gaining greater integrity over time. The problem with Shallan is her denial. It's the way that she shies away from herself. Because, like I said, at the end of the day, she believes that she cannot change, that she is intrinsically bad. And Pattern is bringing her back into contact with herself in order, I think, to reveal to her that everybody is this paradox. Everybody is the same contradiction that she's presenting to her followers. That's also true about her. And that in the fullness of her story in the Stormlight Archive, hopefully, I think the way that Pattern sees things is that she will be able to appreciate the actual good things about herself, and that the good things are not the lies, that there are good things that she is keeping back from herself with the lies. And so the other major part of the Tritagonist trilogy is Dalinar, of course, where, Dalinar's struggle continues to unify the kingdom of Roshar, of Alethkar. And so he's trying to literally force all of the high princes to follow the king with a better sense of integrity, to try and end the war with the Parshendi, and to prepare for some kind of inevitable battle that's going to happen. It's like literally getting countdown to with each one of his visions. Oh, and I almost forgot. Let me go back to Shallan for 1 second before I dip into Dalinar's thing fully, where this whole thing with Shallan progressing, of course, she also, progresses in her oaths, if you will, or whatever, where she has to tell the truth about herself. And that, moved into this kind of confession about what really happened with her mother. And that was the whole uncovering of the lie and the progression of truth inside of her. That has to do with words. And the same thing with Kaladin, right? Like he had to say the particular words of his oath in order to progress. And then that was ratified with the glyph that appears on the ground and the burst of power that he gets from Syl, and he reconnects with Syl. And a similar thing happens at the end of Dalinar's story with the Stormfather. And it just reminds me of these connections throughout the Cosmere that have to do with like in Warbreaker, how you had to say certain words for the investiture to go into the object and to do the thing that you want it to do, but also like the importance of language in Elantris and in the Emperor's Soul, how you have to say certain words, and then that requires also this alignment of intention with the words that to me feels related to the closeness of the word with the land itself in Elantris, that there is a narrowing of the gap again between signified and signifier in terms of language in the system of magic on Roshar, where in Mistborn, the magic is almost purely intentions, that words don't play into it very much, that everything is just kind of internal and you direct the way that the magic operates with your mind and kind of calibrate all that. That's true on Roshar as well in terms of how you deal with the magic in any given moment. But to progress to deeper levels of the magical powers, it requires saying words that are closely aligned with a kind of integrity. And so I think that's really, really important. It's a big connection between all of these stories that we're seeing in the Cosmere. I think it says something, larger in the story about consistency and integrity and about language itself and these hard limits that I keep saying about good and evil, that if you just saying the words is not enough. Like you have to mean them. And the words kind of come to Kaladin in a way that feels supernatural. And with Shallan, because it is a personal truth, it feels more organic that it comes to her, but it also feels like the words are ratified by the Stormfather. He's like, these words are accepted. That's the thing we hear over and over from the Stormfather. And so there's some kind of outside force of supernatural judgment ratifying the kind of spiritual progress of these characters. And so that's why I say that there is these kind of materialistic limits of good and evil. You couldn't cynically progress in this spiritual system. You have to actually mean it. In the same way that the language had to actually represent the land itself in Elantris. And in Warbreaker, you had to actually visualize the right command that you're thinking about while you're actually saying the right words at the same time. So there's this alignment of language and like the signifier and the signified that has to do with a materialist sense of particular realness in the universe. It's not just all relative and you think you're a good person, therefore you're a good person. There's hard limits that the characters could come up against and real blocks in their progression or failures that would indicate, a lack of goodness in them. But to get back to Dalinar, I see this same kind of problem I think I talked about in Mistborn that had to do with this notion of Thomas Hobbes, right? That the philosopher in the real world, the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who comes up with the beginnings of what would be the social contract in Western thinking that's so important in the way that the British system is organized and subsequently the United States and other modern Republican democracies. This idea that the way that we organize around leaders is due to the fact that at our core, we are selfish beings that are always in competition with everyone around us for limited and finite resources, and that there's a constant war of man against man, is how Hobbes says it, that is endless. And the only way that we are able to find security and safety for the future is to rally around kings and leaders who we invest with our freedom to do harm to other people at any given time. We give up the right to have this war of all against all in favor of giving the king the responsibility to say who we are at war with, so that we can all trust in the peace that the king creates by protecting us from other societies and allowing our society to therefore progress and develop. And so the contract that we have with the leader is that we will not perpetrate violence on the leader as long as the leader protects us. And it's a view of people that is kind of, I find, cynical and depressing and like the opposite of what is being posed in the Cosmere, that fundamentally at their core people are good. But that whole man at war with every other man is the way in which Alethi society is constructed, right? The high princes are in constant competition with each other, and so they are fractured, and Dalinar has this mandate from his visions to unify them, that he's supposed to bring everybody together. But instead, he's has to contend with the way in which they're always competing against each other and undermining the efforts that has to make them into a singular kingdom. Instead, it's as if they're fractured into many princedoms that do not rally around the king, because I think essentially they don't trust him. There's a failure of the social contract with Elhokar because Elhokar is an ineffective leader, and so he doesn't provide that prosperity and protection that a king is supposed to in the social contract. Therefore, nobody honors the contract. That's why Dalinar has to kind of supersede the king's authority in the story and step into the place that Elhokar fails to provide leadership, and to take power away from the princes and require them with violence, if necessary, to participate in this, social contract, to submit to the authority of the crown, whether they feel like they're getting the benefits of that social contract or not. And I think the essential problem with Dalinar has to do with that same kind of thinking that I was talking about with Taravangian and the other villainous characters throughout the Cosmere, that there's a foregone conclusion that this is an intractable problem in the princes, that there's no way to not make them selfish, that there's a foreclosure of who they are at their core. And that makes sense that Dalinar believes that. The Way of Kings showed him having hope for the entire book, that Sadeas was a person who he absolutely was not. And then, when Sadeas reveals who he is and he betrays Dalinar, then it's like, oh my God, I can't believe that this happened to me. I've been stabbed in the back. I will never, ever trust anyone again. And so this is Dalinar's, kind of trauma response, the maladaptive behavior that he has to the trauma of, his good friend Sadeas betraying him. He is going to believe throughout this story that the princes are not capable of doing the right thing, and therefore he has to take over their conscious behavior and kind of like manipulate them in the way that, like, he wants them to be, for him, what Szeth is for Taravangian, right? He wants to turn them into obedient tools to construct this kingdom that will be functional in the way that he believes it needs to be in order to meet the challenge of the Everstorm that his visions are telling him about over and over. And again, we've seen in the story over and over that this is the wrong way to think, that this is evil. The good way to think is to have hope and to reframe what is possible for people and to allow them the freedom to step into that space and become better people. That is what good leadership in the Cosmere is, and this kind of tyrannical, dysfunctional behavior is not going to work. And Dalinar even talks to Wit about this and is like, am I a tyrant? Am I a bad person? Should I not be this way? And Wit is like, hey, first off, don't trust whatever I say, because I will literally let your world burn to the ground. I don't think he says that to Dalinar. He might say that to Kaladin. I can't remember. But he's like, second of all, maybe what people need in this time and place is a tyrant. And while I don't think that it's a good way to be, maybe it is the right thing for this time. But I don't think that the story exactly ratifies that point of view, because the problem with Dalinar is that he's looking in the wrong direction, right? The people that he wants to control their behavior and change who they are, and the people that he subsequently endorses and invests in are all the wrong direction. So he makes Amaram the leader of the Knights Radiant, and we know that Amaram is the exact wrong person for that job, that he is a cynical betrayer, that he is invested in instrumentalizing people, that he believes that light eyes are intrinsically better than dark eyes, and that he is caught up in Taravangian's cynical project of, believing that they're going to lose and just trying to get the best losing outcome possible. And so that is the exact opposite of the Knight's creed of life before death and strength before weakness and journey before destination. Like, you've already decided on the destination, so the journey becomes irrelevant and you just throw that out the window and you're calibrating all of your choices based on the destination. Which, by the way, is why telling the future on Roshar is so fraught and associated with evil, because it puts you in direct contact with the destination and it forecloses the value of the journey. The journey instead becomes just a functional tool of creating a destination that is the most optimal version of the inevitable outcome that will definitely happen. And so we see Renarin in the story trapped by feelings of inevitability. And in fact, like at the end of the story, Renarin is caught in a cycle of hopelessness where he's like, the Everstorm is here, the time is up, we can't do anything. And he's just kind of wailing and rocking on the floor and filled with despair. And so he's paralyzed in a kind of inaction where the rest of the characters are like, okay, the crisis is here, but let's find the solution to the crisis. And so Renarin is trapped in the destination while the rest of the characters are still on the journey. And maybe the characters will fail, but like at the end of the day, that's not the point of the journey. It doesn't matter where you end up. You're just doing your best as you go along the way. That's not Dalinar's approach with these princes. He's already decided that they're not capable of being trustworthy stewards of unity within the kingdom. Instead, they're going to be selfish, dysfunctional ruiners of the project of community. And so he's already written off people like Sabariel and Roion and Aladar. He sees them as cowards, as spoilers, as selfish layabouts who are not capable of participating in the kingdom in a functional way. And those are all the people who end up showing up for him at the end and providing him with the unity necessary to challenge the Parshendi. And at the same time, while he's making Amaram the head of the Knights Radiant, he's not seeing how Kaladin is becoming one of the Knights Radiant right in front of him. He's not seeing his potential daughter-in-law, Shallan, as the Knight Radiant that she is. He's constantly looking in the wrong direction throughout the story. And I think that's a signal to us as readers that the approach that Dalinar has as a tyrant is dysfunctional and bad, that he is going in an evil direction and leading the kingdom into disaster quite literally. Like when he goes to this final battle at Narak, kind of trusting in the visions that he has, that this confrontation is completely inevitable and unavoidable, and that the princedom has to come together and must be forced into that state of being instead of being led into that state of being. What happens symbolically on Narak is that you have these, instead of one storm, you have two storms, and the storms clash into each other, and it utterly destroys the location of the warfare, and it irrevocably puts a distance between the Parshendi and the humans. There's no peace that can be found between these communities that, seem to be finding their way to each other throughout the story, and suddenly they're ripped apart. The whole thing is a total disaster. That is the direct result of Dalinar's leadership. It's not like a tragic, he's doing the right thing and everyone is working against him kind of a situation. It is a direct result, and it is the story showing us, that this is quote unquote bad leadership. This is literally bad leadership in the way that I'm saying that the Cosmere has these hard walls of good and evil, that Dalinar is going down the wrong path, because it's the same cynical kind of path that assumes the destination before the journey has been traveled. So for all of Dalinar's progress that he's made since the death of his brother, and this, kind of personal development of who he is becoming, he still has a long way to go. And when you examine the difference between Shallan and Kaladin, I said this before in The Way of Kings too, Dalinar is more isolated and alone than either of them are. Shallan has begun to surround herself with a small crew of people who are her followers and who know the truth about her and understand, that she has a shard blade and know all of these secrets about her. She has Adolin, she has Gaz, she has, her little group of traitors and thieves and liars who are following her and forming a kind of community. Kaladin has Bridge 4. Dalinar has Navani, and he has, the rest of his family, but they understand him in a different context than he understands himself. They know everything about his past. Elements of his past are hidden from him. He sees himself as having to live up to these impossibly difficult standards that he also is holding up the rest of the kingdom to. And he doesn't see himself as being successful in those standards. And so he's like, I think he's holding everyone away kind of at arm's length, because that's some element of the propriety that he has bought into for himself. As close as he is letting Navani move towards him, and as close as he's pulling Kaladin into his inner circle, he still holds both of them away from him, where he won't allow himself to be vulnerable, because that vulnerability to him leads to disaster, like his brother dying and like this eventual collapse of the kingdom itself into this fractured mess. He sees that as something that he's responsible for in terms of being too lenient on everyone, that he was too vulnerable with everyone in the kingdom and like showing his true soft face to them And then they just slapped that face as a response. And so he needs to be less vulnerable with everyone. He needs to have less community and not meet people where they are, but force them to be where they need to be, the same way that he is forcing himself to change into something new. And all of that is like a dysfunction. He's projecting his dysfunction onto the kingdom itself. And in the meantime, any of the success that the kingdom is experiencing is directly responsible to the people that he is not investing in. And so I think the whole story of Dalinar's arc in this thing operates to undermine all of his choices and show us that he has been doing the wrong thing this whole time. And at the end of the story, when he turns to the Stormfather and makes the bond with him, that's the first step in a truly new direction where he has made a connection with another being. And we know that these spiritual creatures intercede into the trauma itself and help to achieve a new kind of realignment that has to do with a personal integrity, the way that I talked about with Shallan and Kaladin. And so this is the beginning of Dalinar's journey into something new. But even the way that he encounters the Stormfather and bonds with him has to do with Dalinar dominating the Stormfather, that he is saying, this will happen. You will bond with me. You will be this for me. And so he continues in his dysfunction, in his maladaptive behavior, because, we're like 2 stories into a 5-story arc. So there needs to be like a lot of runway for this story to continue. But I think it just shows the way in which Dalinar progresses very little in this story until the end. And he experiences massive failure by the end of the story, that his way of leading the kingdom absolutely does not work. And it even goes so far as for him to tell Adolin, like, you're a much better man than I ever was. You're in a way better position to become the leader of this family, perhaps even the leader of this country, than I ever would have been. And what do we see in Adolin's behavior at the end of the story? He murders Sadeas in hand-to-hand close-up combat, that it is a down and dirty street fight between the two of them, and that he doesn't feel remorse about it. And so he is not the person that Dalinar believes him to be. There's a failure of fatherhood there, and a misalignment of his perceptions of his ability as even a father and a nurturer to who his son turns out to be, that like Dalinar just does not understand the way to be a good person in this story. Like everything that he sets out to do, he fails at, which is such an interesting place to put one of your heroes in your story. And I don't think that emotionally that is our experience of Dalinar's story, in reading this book. I don't think, like, if you had to talk to me the first time that I read this book and said, like, oh, did you notice the way in which Dalinar is a total failure? I would have been like, no, he's not. He, successfully led them against the Parsendi, and, he knew the right thing to do all along, and on like that. But when we look symbolically and compare his journey with Kaladin's journey and Shallan's journey and frame it within this larger context of the Cosmere, I think what pops out right away is that Dalinar's on the wrong path. He is met with failure at the end of this story that he has to pivot and turn around from. And the rest of his story is going to have to be about becoming a different kind of guy, or failing to do that and falling, into the same kind of evil that we've seen the other characters like Taravangian fall into, and Strath Venture and Deloff, and on in the story, the larger Cosmere story, if you will. And so it's just a really cool choice. I think it's one of the things that the tritagonist structure affords Sanderson, and a trick that he really hasn't tried before this, where, like in Elantris, you have Rathan as kind of the villainous character, and he does this turn right at the end of the story and he instantly dies and, kind of sacrifices himself to save his friends. But that's not the same thing as having, he kind of finds success and redemption in that turn, that journey that he goes on at the end. That's not the same as using this structure to where at the end of the story, we feel like Kaladin won because he beat Zeth. We feel like Shallan won because, she successfully infiltrated the Ghost Bloods. And we got to Urithiru, which was her goal in the story, was to, finish Yasna's work. So there's this feeling of a good ending and of success at the end of the novel. But then we incorporate into that this failure that Dalinar has. And so I don't think it reads as a failure. It doesn't emotionally feel that way. But in analyzing the story, I don't think there's any other way to interpret Dalinar's journey other than he doubles down on his kind of trauma response and the story kicks him in the teeth. This strategy is not the way to unify them. It's a false unification, and he has been misjudging people. He's been misjudging people's capacity. He's been treating everyone the way that Thomas Hobbes configures the human condition instead of the more optimistic way I think that Brandon Sanderson sees people and has constructed them in the Cosmere. So going forward, Dalinar's journey is going to have to be more optimistic and more enlightened. And to just step back from those three characters and talk a little bit more about, like, in a general way, some things that I see in the story that are really interesting. Comparing Pattern to Silfrena, Kaladin's Spren and Shallan's Spren, all kinds of interesting things pop out. There's a way in which those two cultures of Spren are misaligned or have an antagonism between them. It feels like Pattern's core origin of like where the patterns come from has to do with like these fundamental elements of reality itself, like, mathematical descriptions of like the force of gravity or electromagnetism or like E equals MC squared, that kind of thing, like the fundamental reality of nature itself and the way in which that is expressible in mathematical equations. That seems to be where Patterns people come from. And then the Honor Spren feel like they come from this interaction of human society. There's something more abstract about the origin of that, the way that it's not how people see each other, but how people see the ideal interaction of the way that we should interact with each other, like the medium of society itself and the way that's constituted through connections that are honorable. And so that's like very abstract. That's very tied to human experience and sociality and all of that kind of stuff. And so it seems like to me that, we see this kind of mental progression that reminds me of the Khandra in Mistborn, where they are these mist wraiths out there in the wild that are kind of mindless. They're something like animals. And then when they are given some spikes through hemalurgy, they gain sapience and have a personality and a mind and all of that kind of stuff. In the same way, the Spren come into a spiritual bond with their partner and are kind of mindless. We see Pattern like butting against the wall over and over like a little baby and things like that, and being like a little weirdo. And Syl was kind of like that in the way that she was goofy in the beginning of The Way of Kings and played all these practical jokes on Kaladin. And then they progress into being more three-dimensional, fully fleshed out individuals who have their own personality. And we see other Spren throughout the story as well. I'm kind of ignoring all the interludes and the other Radiance who are introduced to us, even though I love all those short stories, but I've already gone on so long. But I think this is actually really significant to what Sanderson's doing. I think there's something interesting here. Like, for example, Pattern to me feels gendered male in the story, and then Shallan is a female, and Syl is gendered female, and Kaladin is a male. And so there's something there, again, about that yin-yang energy that not just between Kaladin and Shallan, but saying something about like the disposition of people, that there's an incompleteness to our kind of gendering of ourselves. This goes to like core ideas of Freud and Carl Jung in the way that we are constructed psychically, like in our psychological disposition. Jung believed that we have a way that we see ourselves, and then the projection that we have, not of our total opposite, which is kind of the Jungian shadow, all of these elements that we deny about ourselves, but a projection that we have of the opposite of ourselves, the other person, and the way that we construct the opposite gender in our mind as an idealized potential mate, right? So if you're a man, you have an idealized version of a woman, and maybe that's based on your experience of like your mother and other female figures who nurtured you as a young person, according to Jung. And then he calls that the anima. And this is an unconscious archetype that exists in your psyche that controls the way in which you calibrate yourself as a man in this example. So there are certain boundaries you won't cross because that is unmasculine of you and belongs to the anima of womanhood that lives inside your psyche. And so you recognize those womanly qualities that you ascribe to the anima in the women that you are attracted to as a man, according to Jung, and that you cannot be a full and well-balanced person without this element inside of yourself that is constructing the opposite gender. So there's a way in which you kind of, like the yin-yang symbol, right? You imagine these two teardrops of black and white, right? But they have that dot inside of each of them that is the opposite color. That is like the anima. You are holding within yourself the element of the opposite, and that is what allows you to have connection and discourse, not only with yourself, but with your opposites as well. And so I think there's a way in which Syl is the anima of Kaladin, if you will, that she operates as this balance of the dot within the yin-yang for Kaladin that helps to balance him out spiritually. And the same for Shallan, that there needs to be an opposite of gendering for the characters in order to compensate for the characters are kind of constructed with a lack. We talked about this in terms of the trauma, right? They have a trauma response. That response is inadequate to meet with the actual vicissitudes of life. And the Spren helps to step into those gaps and alleviate it. In the same way that the character of Shallan is inadequate to meet with everything, that is required of her in her journey, and Pattern fills in those gaps. That's the same thing that the anima does for you psychically in Jung's system. It allows you to deal with people who are essentially opposite of you because you already contain an archetype of who and what they are. Another thing I want to talk about is the theme of war in the Cosmere. So up to this point, we've had Elantris and Mistborn are like the big stories. And on both of those worlds, war is rare. I guess Warbreaker too. And Warbreaker, it's right there in the story, in the name of the story, Warbreaker. You got war. But even in Warbreaker, war is rare. There's a real problem with all of those characters that there is a threat of war. War is on the horizon. War is a thing that could happen. And a big part of the problem for all of those stories is that everybody is inexperienced at war, that there has been long periods of, if not peace, then at least a lack of major conflict. And so the characters don't know how to fight wars. And that's part of the threat of the problem. So like in Elantris, there's this threat that Wraithen's people are going to invade, and that, because the Elantrians were so magically potent in the past, nobody would dare to invade their land because they would just, they didn't have to use warfare and armies because they had magical powers to resist other people's military prowess. A similar thing in Warbreaker, people don't actually go to war. They have these kind of drone constructs made from dead bodies, and they send those things off to war. And so people don't really know how to fight a war in a formal sense. They use these machines to do it for them, essentially. I mean, I understand they're not actually machines, but you get what I'm saying. And then in Mistborn, the Ska did not know how to fight the Lord Ruler in terms of like forming an army, because the Lord Ruler had kind of perfectly unified the entire human world under his command. And so there was nobody had fought against anybody else, so nobody knew how to fight a war. Therefore, no armies could rise up against him. And so that was a big problem in the story as well. So when you get the Kolos showing up at the gates of the capital in Mistborn, they don't know how to fight back. They don't know how to marshal an army to fight the Kolos because there's never been a real army formed for like 1,000 years. That's not true on Roshar. A big difference between all of the other cultures that we have encountered and Roshar is that war is fundamental to the Alethi culture. These guys are at each other's throats all the time. War is actually where the story starts, right? If we think back to the Way of Kings, the prologue that happens 3,000 years in the past is at the end of a war. And then we begin the actual story in the midst of a battle, that has to do with a war between two princes that Kaladin is involved with. So war is a fundamental theme. I haven't really brought it up yet. That is fundamentally different about Roshar than it is the other worlds. The other worlds have no experience of war, and Roshar is so wrapped up in war that it is literally a part of their religion. They believe that when you die, you just move on to the next step in the war that never ends, right? Like you don't go to heaven, you go to a war where you're trying to get into heaven. You're trying to get heaven back. So that's like a really big contrast with the rest of the Cosmere and feels like an evolution to me of these ideas about we've, encountered the notion of soldiers and of fighting a war and the danger of war. But now we're really like looking into what exactly is war in the Cosmere? How does war interact with these hard materialistic limits of good and evil that I've been talking about? The moral realism of the Cosmere, and so on and so forth. And I think it's too early in a way. I mean, despite the massive, massive length of these two books, it is somehow still too early to determine if war itself is a good or an evil thing in the Cosmere. And like, what does it mean that these people have so deeply internalized war that, Kaladin's heroism is directly linked to his potency on the battlefield. And the same for like the way that Dalinar and Adolin construct their identity around their, holding the shards on the battlefield and fighting on the front lines and things like that. So something totally different is happening in the Stormlight Archive as it relates to this theme of war in the Cosmere. And I think it's directly linked to this idea of the journey before the destination. There is a way in which understanding the living out of a life and progressing and arcing through your trauma is the same experience as war. And the final destination of either peace or desolation is kind of irrelevant to that final journey. Like we think of, the destination as giving meaning to everything that came before it. But I think there's a demonstration in all of this warfare of the way in which these battles create meaning in and of themselves. And so there's, we can look at the progress of the characters in terms of the particular battles that they go through literally along the way. So there's like, for Kaladin, the battle where he teaches the bridge crew to defend themselves with their bridge. There's the first battle that Kaladin goes on, the very first time carrying a bridge. And then there's this battle against Zeth that happens in the clouds. And each one of those marks a different path on his journey and signifies a different meaning in the path of his life that has nothing to do with an ending necessarily, but constitutes its own meaning within itself because the battle is part of a larger war. So I guess what I'm saying is like war is a metaphor for a life lived itself. There's a way in which if you have undergone trauma, you're living with PTSD, you're living under depression, you're living with the loss of your family, which all of these main characters have in common, that experience is something like war. And so the way that you dramatize that mundane journey that all of us have of a traumatic past, of losing loved ones, is situating it within the context of warfare. Another interesting element that we see throughout the Cosmere, I think, is the pools of water that we've gotten in each of the three major worlds. I think in Warbreaker it's mentioned that there are pools of water where the special flowers grow. I might be making that up in my head. I'm not totally sure, but in Elantris there was a pool of water. I don't think I talked about this at all in my analysis of Elantris, but there's a pool of water where they put one of the old Elantrians and it kind of like dissolves his body and he goes away. And it's a way to end the suffering of the Elantrians. It's a choice that they are given as a way out. And then, of course, in Mistborn, there's the pool at the Well of Ascension that Vin goes into, and it is somehow tied to Preservation's power and seems to be an actual accumulation of Preservation's energy in and of itself, much like the mists, which are also, I guess, kind of water particles. And so there's something here about like water and the spiritual power, the investiture, the characters call it, in the magic system of the Cosmere. And we get reports of this from Rock in the story that, his society that lives up in the highlands has these hot springs and that the springs are somehow supernaturally significant. There's something special about them where the spren will just like pop out of them in a way that like is the opposite of what was happening on Elantris, right? Where you put a physical body into this pool and it dissolved away. And then there's these supernatural creatures that are kind of pouring out of the pool sometimes. And so there's something about these pools in the Cosmere that like is a common theme that kind of connects them together. And I remember when I was reading the books and I wasn't like looking up fan theories online and stuff, of like these pools were one of the things where I was like, hey, that's really similar between all of these books. It's one of the things that connects them. So I think that's like an intentional signal that Sanderson is giving us, that these are common elements on all the worlds, in the same way that we have these common elements of like there's honor and preservation and ruin and on like that. And then, of course, like just the little Easter egg in this story of Nightblood is delightful, that we get, we had Vasher in the persona of Zyle, and then we get Nightblood right at the end. It's undeniable who it is. And so that's like a fun thing to come back into the story and links them together in a much more concrete way than, all of these kind of thematic connections and the motifs of the water pools and things like that. These are characters who are crossing over from one story to another. And it feels like from one world to another, right? That they're not on the same planet anymore, because on the world of Warbreaker, there weren't the 3 moons and the various constellations in the sky that they talk about and stuff. So this is a totally different planet. And so it feels like the worlds are coming together more in the Stormlight Archive than they do in the other stories. And that's probably because Sanderson just has so much more room in the massive, massive page count of the story. And so after this, I'm going to be moving on to some more short stories. I'm going to get into Allomancer Jack and the Pits of Elania, or Eltania, that's how you say it. I definitely know what I'm talking about. And the 6th of Dusk. And then moving back to Mistborn. And so you can see that Sanderson is doing the same thing of irresponsibly refusing to write Stormlight Archive books and being a real like lazy layabout in the way that he approaches his universe, with no sense of what fans deeply need in terms of like what's the next part of this story. Instead, we're just gonna drop it here. We found Urithiru, big deal. I hope you want to go back to Cowboy Mistborn. I actually do kind of want to go back to Cowboy Mistborn, so it's fine. But yeah, so that's going to be what the next episode is about. Should come out much, much faster, because I don't have to read a massively huge doorstopper of a book to get through the next 3 or so stories.